Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. If you've been here with us from the beginning of the series, or if it's your first one, welcome. Today, we will be speaking on economic operators under the MDR and specifically a notified body perspective. So, notified body audit. We have Salman Raza here. So, I'll introduce our speakers. Firstly, I'm Megan. I will be moderating. I'll be popping in and out. We have a few polls throughout. But our main speaker is Daniëlle from our team at MedEnvoy Global. She's the Director of Regulatory Affairs and PRRC. And then our guest speaker today, Salman Raza. He is the notified body here. He is actively performing audits. So he's coming from Resolution Bureau as a principal consultant. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Salman Raza walking through our agenda and what we'll be covering today. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you once again for having me on this webinar series. So as Megan said, even though I'm independent, but I actively audit on behalf of various notified bodies. So we'll be sharing some information and what auditors look for during an audit while auditing the topic of economic operators. So our session will introduce the terminology, economic operators. We'll try to understand the requirements and what type of non-conformities we encounter during an audit. So that's our the core topic. So before we move further, we have a poll. So can we run the first poll to begin with?
Right. How familiar are you with the roles of responsibilities of economic operators under the MDR and IVDR? So it looks like so far, majority are saying somewhat familiar, followed by very familiar, and then a few not familiar.
Okay, that's good. We'll give a few more seconds for everyone to respond, and then we'll dive into some fundamentals of the economic operators. And I think that should be enough time. Let's move on. So economic operators under MDR and IVDR, they identify primarily four entities as economic operators. So manufacturers, authorized representatives within EU, importers, and distributors. So these are the four primary entities that are considered economic operators under the medical device regulations. Or out of those outside these four entities, or a person that is part of the product supply chain. So if anyone is involved with the procedure packs, they also have some consideration for economic operators. So from a definition perspective, a manufacturer, I'm sure everyone is aware of who the manufacturer is, but just a quick refresher in the context, any natural or legal person or entity that takes full responsibility of a device, whether it's a refurbish or design from scratch, and they are the legal manufacturer or legal entity. They hold the technical documentation, they hold the product. So they are ultimately responsible for the product. So they are considered, and they are responsible for maintaining compliance against the regulations, make sure that all the regulatory requirements are met, individual territory, region, maintain a management system, ensuring the effective post-market surveillance regime is in place, and ensure that the labeling and safety performance are in place. So that's pretty well understood role as a manufacturer. The second on the list is authorized, EU authorized representative. So an entity that represent the manufacturer if manufacturer is outside the European Union. So they have to appoint an entity that can represent them within the EU. So remember, as a general principle, the EU law cannot be enforced on any entity outside the European Union. So we must have an entity that takes that responsibility. They become legally responsible for the product within the EU. So authorized representative takes that role, and they represent the manufacturer that are located outside EU. So they are any natural or legal person established within the union. They have received and accepted written mandate from the manufacturer. So that is important. Manufacturer have to give them a mandate to act on their behalf. And then they have certain responsibilities. So I don't act as authorized representative, but we have someone who can talk about from the authorized EU authorized representative perspective. So MedEnvoy take that role. They act as an EU authorized representative. So let's hear the responsibility of an AR from Daniëlle.
Yeah, so as an AR, I think the fundamental basis is that we, under the MDR now, are equally liable with manufacturers, and that makes the role of the AR also, well, more important, as also we want to ensure that manufacturers meet the requirements of the MDR. So by our legal obligations, we need to ensure that an AR has their declaration of conformity, CE certificates. If available, we need to check whether the appropriate conformity assessment and procedure has been followed, and that there is compliance to the registration obligations, so registration in UDMED. So currently, UDMED registration is not mandatory, it's highly advised. But that's also the reason why authorized representatives review the technical file. And they can do it slightly in a different way, but ultimately we need to ensure that the manufacturers meet their general obligations and that the products that are placed on the European market meet the regulatory requirements. And if an AR becomes aware that a manufacturer acts contrary to the requirements as stated in the MDR, then we as an AR have the legal obligation to inform the competent authority of that with the reason involved if we would decide to terminate the mandate due to that reason. So yeah, we need to execute what is in the mandate. At the same time, we want to ensure that the market entrance is as smooth as possible.
Thank you, Daniëlle. So just to give you another perspective of what it means to be and how important that role is, authorized representative is the one is kind of effectively saying to the regulators within the Europe that I will be, or we will be, happy to go to jail on the manufacturer's behalf. So if anything goes wrong, authorized representatives are responsible and they can go to jail. So that's how important role that is. So that has to be taken very carefully, and they are responsible for the product within the EU. So that's important entity within the economic operators umbrella. The third one is also important, and one of the key one that we need to focus this session. So an importer is any natural or legal person established within the union that places the device from a third country on the union market. So again, we are assuming that a manufacturer that is located outside the European Union, they are coming to place a product in the EU market. They need an EU authorized representative, and then they need an importer. So, so they are also a legal entity. They has a financial ownership of the product. As soon as it crosses the border into EU, they becomes responsible. So their responsibility is they place a non-EU product in the EU market, confirming the regulatory requirements are met, and they maintains records devices. So, so they are also important in the years gone by. Scrutiny around importers was not as stringent as it is now under MDR. So your arrangements with importers um, um, is very important. So, from importer perspective, uh, we also have a Daniëlle, of course. MedEnvoy also act as an importer. So let's talk hear from Daniëlle before we um, run another poll. Daniëlle, what's the role of an importer?
Yeah, so maybe to clarify that each of the economic operators in the full supply chain of a device, so from manufacturer to the end user, they have their own role, all responsibilities, but there is also an overlap. So when we look at the role of the importer needs to verify that the device is CE marked, that there is a declaration of conformity, the importer needs to check whether the manufacturer is identified, whether there is an AR identified on the labeling, and they need to identify themselves as well to ensure that a next economic operator in the supply chain understands that those checks already have been done. In addition, they have responsibility to ensure that the devices are accompanied by the correct or by the IFU intended by the manufacturer, and they need to check whether the devices are registered in UDMAT, if UDMAT is fully active, but they need to confirm that the UDI is assigned, which is also something that can be viewed already from the labeling. And as we are all aware, the deadline of 26th of May 2025 is approaching, where, for example, for class 1s, then the UDI on the labeling becomes mandatory. Well, that then also needs to be checked by importers accepting that role.
Excellent. So that's really important. So you understand that even though EU authorized representative, they have legal responsibility. Importers are not acting on behalf of manufacturer, but they are ensuring on ground that the product meets the requirements labeled IFU, as Daniëlle said, whereas EU RAP is making sure that all the legal aspects, all the compliance aspects, from at least from documentation and registration perspective, and all the framework in collaboration and with all the economic operators are in place. So that's the role of an importer. We have a second poll, so shall we run the poll?
Which area of compliance for economic operators do you find most challenging to understand or implement? Okay, looks like right now labeling and packaging requirements is in the lead. Oh, post-market surveillance and corrective actions. We did cover that on our last webinar too, so if you didn't attend, we have a recording of that on our website. Traceability and record keeping is also getting a lot of votes, but mainly post-market surveillance and then followed by labeling and packaging requirements. Okay,
yeah, but I can quickly speak on the fact that, of course, as both as an AR, but also as an importer, in fact, each economic operator has their own role in market surveillance, so in vigilance reporting, informing manufacturers of complaints that are that you receive to ensure that timely action is taken. As an AR, obviously you have the responsibility that correct and timely vigilance reporting is performed by the manufacturer, and you can also do that as an AR on behalf of the manufacturer, depending on the mandate that is in place.
Excellent. So moving on to our third entity on the list, distributors. So distributors are also considered economic operators, and they are any natural or legal person in the supply chain other than the manufacturer or importer or authorized representative. And then they are making sure that the product reaches to the end user or the putting point of service. So that's important distinction. It could be individual shops, pharmacies, retailers, legal person meeting the definition. So basically, they are selling the product or making sure the product gets to the end user. Uh, so um, so that's, and there can be several distributors in the region. So you are not limited to one. You have to have you can have several. Usually there's only one authorized rep, usually is only one importer. They can, but distributors, certainly you can have more than one. So they're responsible for handling and storage, transportation, delivery of medical devices within the EU, um, any commissioning requirements if it is agreed upon. So they are also taking these type of actions. So that's distributor, relatively straightforward to understand. Um, One of the terminology introduced in the MDR is the person responsible for regulatory compliance, so PRRC. So they are effectively, as you are aware, they ensures that they maintain device conformity and they have adequate provisions within the quality management systems for product recall, post-market surveillance, a declaration of conformity, technical documentation, maintenance. So all those things that are required, they are responsibility of the PRRC. Medical Device Regulation, MDR, has introduced some very defined criteria who can be a PRRC. Of course, these expectations are covered in Article 15. In the context of today's presentation, it is important that we understand that a PRRC is required for manufacturers, authorized representatives. So these two economic operators, they must have PRRC identified, manufacturers and authorized representatives. PRRC is not required for distributors and importers, usually not required unless if they are importing and distributing product listed in um, um, Annex 16. Danielle, did you want to add something on that point?
Yeah, so maybe for attendees that market their products in multiple markets. So when we compare, for example, the PRC requirements in Switzerland, although Switzerland is in fact following the MDR, they have the added criteria that in that market you need to assign a deputy PRC. So that is mandatory, although it's good practice enough for other markets. That is actually required, and there are also some exemptions and more clarification on the role of the PRC in the NCG guidance document 2019-7. So if someone wants more background on this topic, that is a helpful guidance document drafted by the NCG group.
Good. So after understanding that, let's take a refresher once we have understood the definitions of these roles. There are some other terminologies that are very important. So once we understand those terminologies, it will become even easier to understand the interaction between these economic operators. So the first one is making available on the market. So if anyone is making the product available, so that is any supply of a device other than an investigational device for distribution, consumption, or use on the EU market. So that activity is known as making product available on the market. Now, the terminology that is used for placing the product on the market, is the first making available of a device other than the investigational device. So when you bring the product for the first time in the EU, that is called placing on the market. That is usually the role of an importer. So that is important understanding, that placing on the market is traditionally a importer's responsibility. Putting into service is a stage where device has been made available to the final user. So the final user, so they have now access to use the device for the first time. It is called putting into service. So these are the key definitions, and keeping those definition in mind, it helps us understand the interaction and the role of these economic operators. So we have another poll. Should we have the poll number 3?
Have regulatory changes in MDR and IVDR affected your understanding of economic operator responsibilities? All right, it's pretty split. Yes, I've had to adapt to changes recently is leading. Yes, a combo of some, but yes, the majority of people are saying yes, they've had to adapt.
So it is important, and the following slides are even more important. Once you understand the requirements of the economic operators, understanding the terminologies. So if you look at the relationship, so in the sequence of activities, how it happens. So manufacturer is the person or entity that is responsible for product design, manufacture, making the product initially compliant, and then as an output they have a device itself. So if they want to sell the product inside the EU, they need an authorized representative. So they liaise with the authorized representative, go into this contractual agreement, give them the legal mandate to act on their behalf. And then once that is in place, then of course in parallel you need another entity that act as an importer. So under the previous regime, MDD, it was not as closely scrutinized, but now under MDR, these role must be very clearly defined. So from an audit perspective, we need a clear documented evidence that who is acting as an importer and who is acting as authorized. They can be represented by the same entity. However, it is not taken for granted that just because this entity is your EU rep, they are also your importer. We need to see a separate, dedicated, a clear, explicit contract that this entity will act as your importer and this entity act as your authorized representative. So once you have that area covered, then of course the distributor comes into play. The entity or individual, they put the product right into the service where the end user is now able to use the device. So this is the sequence, how it works. But from auditing perspective, it is fundamentally important, and this is where a lot of manufacturers are not understanding, that auditors will be looking for clear demarcation of responsibilities defined within contractual agreement, and they must be clearly identified who is playing what role and what are the documented evidence that you have in your file, that this entity acts as an authorized rep, this entity acts as an importer, these are the responsibilities. If there is an overlap, who will do what? So there should be clear indication of demarcation of responsibilities and interaction. So we will probably talk a little more on that, but fundamentally, look at this slide and you'll know the roles these entities plays, and these are the considered economic operators. Let's hear from authorized representative and importer perspective. Danielle, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I think looking at our involvement in notified body audits, so as an AR or in the on-portal role, we have been questioned on that topic. So that it's clear that they look, for example, to our competence, whether we have a mandate in place, how we work with our customers regarding issuing SRNs when the MDR products are not yet placed on the market. So those kinds of questions we for sure get. And as an AR, as an importer, we are also more and more involved in post-market surveillance activities, and we face more supplier audits, so customer audits, because as an AR, we are considered a critical supplier to these manufacturers, also based upon the fact that Salman, you go there, you audit, and that is your expectation. So that is also something that we have seen changing over time. As such, yeah.
Good. So as we explained what auditors look for when we are on site looking at that, first thing first, we want to see who are those economic operators. We need those clearly identified, that who are acting as your economic operators. So we need to see those defined somewhere in the quality management system. These are my economic operators. That's number one. Then we need to see clear contractual agreement between each economic operator. So the clear contractual agreement with authorized representative, showing that you have given the mandate to them, that they act on your behalf as a manufacturer's behalf. We check if UDAMED registrations are in place. So for example, all the entities, they may be registered on their own, in their own right. So for example, MedEnvoy, they are registered in UDAMED as MedEnvoy, but they act on behalf of several manufacturers. So you have to identify, you have to link your association with specific entity that act as an authorized representative. So we like to see that in place. And the other thing that we are now establishing very clearly, that all the authorized representative must be identified as your supplier, actually critical supplier. So we like to see that you have considered your authorized representative. Either terminology can be different. Some companies, some notified bodies still call it critical supplier. Some notified bodies, they call them relevant supplier. They even use it distinction between relevant subcontractor and relevant supplier. So supplier is someone that supply any components. Subcontractor is someone that is providing a service such as authorized representative. So the important thing from audit perspective, that there is a clear contractual agreement, there is a clear demarcation of responsibility of who is doing what. So for example, in case of a complaint, what is the flow of information like? What importer will do, what distributor will do, what EU rep will do, what manufacturer will do. If they need to be involved in the process, we need to see that established practice in the documentation. And there should be no confusion among the economic operators. So they should not be considered EU authorized rep is under the impression that importer will be doing that. Importer is under the impression that EU rep will be doing that. So we, as an auditor, we like to see that all the flows, all the workflow communication channels are clearly defined, and every economic operators is aware of their own responsibility and everyone is working in harmony. So that is from auditing perspective, it should be clearly defined, clearly identified, and there should be evidence that every economic operator understand their role, and there is a clear documentation and contractual agreement in place. So that is the fundamental intent of the audit. Um, so um, So again, there are some additional requirements under Article 16 where if there are some additional information, I'll let Daniëlle talk about Article 16 a little. But from auditing the economic operators perspective, one word, if I were to emphasize, is clear identification of economic operators within QMS, clear contractual agreement in place, and clearly defining their roles. And everyone should be aware of their roles, what they need to do. So that is that. So just to give you an examples of type of non-conformities that we look at, we'll find these days. For example, a lot of them, economic operators are not defined within the QMS. Contracts are not in place. So a lot of times we do find the contract with the EU authorized representative is indeed in place, but there is no clear indication that they have been given mandate. That's a very common scenario. A lot of times there is no clear contract with the importer, and people are scratching their head during an audit. Who is importer? They're showing distributors, they're showing with the EU rep, but they are not understanding they are different entities, they have different roles. So importer is a lot of times we find it missing link. So companies have contractual agreement with EU rep, they have contractual agreement with distributors, but no mention of importers, no understanding of their roles and requirements. That is important. And of course, the role, demarcation of responsibilities, roles are not clearly defined. We don't know who is doing what and who is responsible for what. There is lack of clarity of information and communication flow. So that is one of the few instances where we find non-conformities under this topic. So just to give you a couple of examples, so if there is no arrangement or agreements, contractual agreement with authorized rep or importer, that is a major non-conformance. So no evidence is, in general, is a major non-conformance. But if there is something in place, there is an agreement, but it does not cover the details, the responsibilities and roles, and who will be doing what, and if they are registered, and how they're going to make changes in the UDAMED, any of these activities that are somewhat there but not quite and inadequately captured, those instances likely to be identified as minor non-conformance. But as soon as we see no evidence, so this is the keyword, no evidence of a certain requirement, that becomes a major non-conformance. So that's a fundamental rule. Daniëlle, you wanted to add a couple of things on that front?
Yeah, I think speaking from an AR perspective, looking at the majors for us when we review the documentation of our customers, we also want to ensure that vigilance reporting is well, obviously is performed in a compliant way. So similar as notified bodies, we will review how that is organized and whether timelines are met, and whether we are informed as an AR, because we also want to, if there are questions, a notified competent authority in this case can reach out to us, and then we need to forward that email. Unfortunately, that happens sometimes when people are cut from the CC, for example. But yeah, that is also doing our due diligence. In general, I think. Yeah, that covers the main topics regarding findings we see, Salman, or concerns we have in addition to the topics you raised.
Excellent. So in conclusion, so what we have seen and wanted to conclude that we must understand the roles and identification of economic operators, understand the requirements and expectation under MDR, translating these requirements into our QMS. So don't leave it to imagination. It has to be clearly defined. You knowing or keeping to yourself, it's a tribal knowledge. For modern regulatory requirements, they don't like tribal knowledge. They want it to be system approach. Everything you know systematically should be reflected within your quality management system. There should be clear and explicit documentation, identifying the roles and responsibilities and communication in place so that when it happens, when it's needed, everything is well defined and runs like a well-oiled machine. Uh, Auditors on site, we only accept objective evidence. So subjective or anecdotal evidence is never satisfactory. So if you have a story to tell, I met this guy, he's my friend, he's been doing it for a number of years, and there is my invoice, there is my uh, sales order, all these type of things, they are not acceptable when it comes to demonstrating compliance against MDR requirement, contractual agreement, clear responsibilities, responsibility definitions, and then similar uh, evidence. So with that, we believe we have one more poll to go. Let's have that one.
Which tools or systems do you use to manage regulatory compliance obligations as an economic operator? Okay, majority are saying document management systems for traceability, with a few others saying manual processes, spreadsheets, email, etc. And then no specific tools in place, but majority is document management systems.
It's good. It's good. So that is good. So with that, thank you once again for attending this series, and we'll be happy to take any questions and answer as appropriate.
Thank you, Salman and Daniëlle. That was very informative. Yeah, so here we have our QR code. Follow us on LinkedIn. We do post a lot of news updates and a lot of great information on there. So please follow us if this felt aligned with the information that you're looking for. We share a lot more on there. All right, moving into the questions. First question we have is, what are the most common non-compliance issues that notified bodies encounter during audits of economic operators?
Good questions. We covered that in previous slides. Not having contractual agreement in place, not clearly identifying responsibilities of each economic operators, not having communication flow defined and followed. So these are the most common non-conformities, specifically in relation to importers. We are seeing a lot more non-conformities where contractual agreement and demarcation of responsibilities of importers and EU RAP is not clearly defined. So these are a few very common non-conformities.
Great, thank you. Next question. How do notified bodies ensure compliance from economic operators that are not directly involved in manufacturing, such as distributors or importers?
Same principle. So contractual agreements. So contractual agreement and role definition is the key. So what we need to expect from manufacturers, that they define who the economic operators are, and they demonstrate that adequate controls they have in place to ensure that activities that they're supposed to facilitate with other economic operators. So as a notified body auditors, we are assessing controls put in place by the manufacturer, because we are auditing the manufacturer and we expect them to take all the arrangements of identifying who the economic operators are, and it's their responsibility, manufacturer's responsibility, to demonstrate to notified body that they are in control by having contractual agreement, clearly defining procedures and showing that they have understood the role of each, and then they liaise with the other economic operators. And similarly, AR, authorized representatives such as MedEnvoy and importers, if you are dealing with a competent entity, authorized representative and importers, they will want to do the same thing because they are taking a significant responsibility within the EU. So they will be making sure that you as a manufacturer is discharging all your legal and compliance requirements. So, but from auditing perspective, we expect manufacturers to demonstrate all in establishment in place.
Yeah,
This
that's
question.
maybe to add to that. So as an AR, we sometimes identify findings or non-performances that were not noticed by notified body. And so, of course, we have more risk and oversight when we look at class one medical device companies, because then there is no oversight from the notified body. So that is not a shared responsibility in that case, so to speak, between an AR and a notified body. But considering notified body sample also during audits, it might well be that ARs identify different compliance issues with a technical file than a notified body, and as long as they are all aligned and that there is not too much overreach, yeah, that's where that's coming from the regulatory obligations each of the economic operators have.
Great, thanks, Danielle. So we did got a question during the presentation, so maybe we can clarify on this. So in slide 9, it indicates the importer takes financial ownership of product. However, I believe MedEnvoy as a third-party importer indicates they do not do this. How are they meeting the requirements, or am I missing something?
Yeah, so as explained in the MDCG 2021-27, sorry, that's the frequently asked questions regarding differences on importers and distributors. It is clearly described that for being an importer, there does not have to be transfer of ownership, taking possession, or any other rights. So you don't, there is no need for actual physical handover of the product. It's just by acting and performing the activities that are related to the role of the importer that makes you an importer as such. And that's also why importers need to identify themselves within the supply chain to avoid that the next economic operator, like the distributor, for example, performs the same checks as the importer would do. And when we, as we explained, the most stringent oversight from economic operators is first the AR, then to a lesser extent the importer, and then to an even lesser extent checks performed by the distributor. So that is to avoid any confusion.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. What responsibilities do economic operators, importers, and distributors have during a recall or FSCA, and how does a notified body verify that they're fulfilling these responsibilities during an audit?
Good question. So as I explained during our presentation, notified bodies during their on-site audit, they expect these to be very well defined within your quality management system. So the workflow, the communication flow should be defined even if this type of event happens. So we need to see the your quality management system procedures for vigilance, for recalls, for field safety, corrective action or notification. What is your established procedure? So what we expect to see, that there is a clear information flow identified, that who becomes aware, who they have to report, who will be interacting and liaising with the competent authority. So there can be several potential mechanisms that between these economic operators undertake certain actions. So from a notified body perspective, it's manufacturer's responsibility to liaise with all the economic operators and come up with a procedure. They define their procedure in consultation and arrangements with their importers and distributors and EU rep, how they want to establish. So there can be several communication methods. So notified bodies or regulation per se don't mandate uh, a certain information, but we want manufacturers to define that very clearly, who will be doing what. And once that is defined during a course of a vigilance or recall, we notified bodies, we ensure that you followed your own procedure. And of course, before that, we ensure that the procedure covers all the regulatory requirements. So primarily to focus from manufacturer's perspective, ensure that whatever you have defined is not in breach of regulatory requirements, clearly identify who will do what, and then from notified body, when they are on site and they are reviewing vigilance or field safety corrective action, we are making sure and verifying that you followed your own procedure. So that's how we ensure on site. Danielle, do you want to add something on it?
Yeah, so I think when those contracts reflect the regulatory requirements, so Article 11 for your AR, Article 13 for your importer, and 14 for your distributor, then you already arrange that they all need to cooperate in cases of field safety corrective action, and they all have distinct roles, but by their own legal obligation, that economic operator needs to forward complaints, needs to cooperate, needs to share data. So the importer will be requested in most of the cases to provide information regarding which products were placed on the market. Then the distributor needs to understand, okay, I shipped it, or the devices ended up with certain end users, which obviously it's an obligation that you can reach those end users at the end. But those responsibilities are currently clearly defined within the MDR, and I think that's a pro in this case.
Great.
Excellent.
Okay. Next question. I think we have time for a few more. With ongoing updates to MDR, how should economic operators stay informed and adjust their processes to remain compliant? Does the notified body provide guidance on adapting to regulatory changes?
Technically speaking, they are not required to. Notified bodies do not get into consulting. Technically speaking, they don't usually do that. However, a lot of notified bodies, they have some on newsletters, they inform. In general, they update what's coming along. So they don't necessarily get engaged with individual updates, but there are several platforms that you can use to receive those newsletters, such as MedEnvoy has a newsletter. You can subscribe to other, you can visit the Europa website where the guidance documents are continuously published. And of course, your notified body, you can ask the question. They may have a periodic newsletter that in general identify what's coming along, but I'm not aware that notified body will inform you, or they must inform you. So you should not expect your notified bodies to inform you about the updates. It's not their responsibility.
No. And just to add to that, so as part of our being an AR, we try to keep our customers involved. So we are monitoring all those websites there was Salman you are referring to, and as a consequence, we actively share that information. Also considering the fact that we want our customers to be informed and up to date with regulatory knowledge to ensure that their products are in compliance at all times in the life cycle.
And that should be part of your quality management system. So if you recall, under management review of the ISO 13485 clause 5.6.2, it lists some management review input. So as a part of your input, you have to identify revised regulatory requirements. So you have to have a process in place, and which defines how frequently you will assess that, how frequently you will review what's coming along, what is the impact of that change or new addition of the regulation on your operation. So you should have a process in place as per your quality management system that also feeds into post-market surveillance, that also feeds into your clinical evaluation. So it's an ongoing process and interacts and interlinks with several other processes that you already have in place. So again, it's a dynamic, interconnected management system. So it should be well defined from different angles as well.
Yeah, and that quality management system, we as an AR consider the fact that we are ISO 13485 certified. We have the same obligations, so then we are asked like, okay, you have these services, how do you ensure that you are kept up to date, first of all, but also how we, again, inform our customers. So that is also part of our registrar side over MedEnvoy in this case.
Okay. All right. If regulatory changes affect the responsibilities of suppliers, example, changes in risk classification or compliance documentation, what steps should economic operators take to ensure their suppliers are compliant, and how is this assessed during a notified body audit?
So notified bodies, they are auditing your process, not the events. So events becomes the evidence of the sample events. They becomes the source of evidence for the conclusion of the audit. But if primarily we're looking at your process, so your process of change management, so you become aware of a potential change. So notified body is looking at how is your process define the change? What do you consider a change? How do you receive the information about the change? How do you assess the change? How do you assess the impacts of that change? And then how do you uh, inform and translate those changes downstream? That includes your suppliers, your economic operators. So from notified body perspective, your change management is important. So we are looking and focusing on your change management process. And then as it happens, we sample a change that a supplier has notified you, or you have become aware and you want to have communication with your suppliers, your economic operators, your authorized representative. So they're all part of your change management system. So from notified body perspective, this is where we start, and these are the elements that we follow the trail. So we start with the change management and then follow the trail and see how you have managed receiving information, assessing information. Once you understand the impact, how do you communicate downstream?
Yeah, but I also think that economic operators like in importer, Salman, they sometimes see the results of changes. So if new products are introduced, they are not added to the declaration of conformity by mistake. So if those products are shipped and then from the role of the importer, you need to check whether a correct DOC is available. So then you would identify in that case that a product is placed in the market for which no DOC is made available. So then the that event will be reported obviously to the manufacturer first. But next steps needs to be taken, and you only see the consequence of that because you see a CAPA related to those cases. But yeah, so our oversight is a little bit different, but for sure that's the added value of the different
And that
activities.
ties in very nicely what we were talking about, the contractual agreement of demarcation of responsibility and communication workflow. So if importers or AR authorized rep or distributors, if they are identifying something, so your contractual agreements and your procedures must have provision in place to communicate that information to the manufacturer. And if they are noticing any inconsistencies, they must communicate with manufacturer, and then of course manufacturer has to take action. So it is also part of a process of communication in all directions.
Okay, thank you. Looking at the time, we had some other great questions in the chat, but we will wrap up here. If we did not get to your question, we'll make sure we follow up with you via email so you can get an answer on that. But thank you all for attending. Thank you, Salman and Danielle, for all of the great information in that Q&A session. We will be sending out all these materials, so the presentation slides, a recording of this via email. You should get that tomorrow as long as you're registered. So you can look for that in your inbox. If you do have any further questions, feel free to reach out to our team in that email too. We'll also have an option for a one-on-one consult with someone on our team. But thank you all for attending. Appreciate your time. We do have our last session of the series tomorrow on technical documentation. So if that is of interest to you, I will pop that in the chat for you to register. And other than that, Danielle, Salman, anything left to say?
Thank you. And as we said many times, it's a journey. It's not an event. So start the journey. The best best step is to take the first step. So all the best for your compliance journey.